once again, all you nerds out there listening and streaming, this is Nerdy by Nature, and I'm your host, Agent Smith.
And I'm Captain Rogers.
So in our last episode, Cap, we strapped ourselves in for a wild ride into the mind and multiple personalities of Mark Spector in the fantastically done collected run of Moon Knight issues 1 through 14 by acclaimed writer Jeff Lemire, with art from Greg Smallwood and beautiful coloring by Jordi Belair. If you haven't heard that episode, feel free to go back and give it a listen, or catch up on any of our other episodes that you might have missed. A friendly reminder to you, the listener, as to where you can find Nerdy by Nature and your boys here. We're basically available wherever you can stream or listen to podcasts, for example, Spotify, YouTube, iTunes, and so on. So Cap, in this episode, we will be reviewing the thrill ride that is Ford versus Ferrari. It's based off of an incredible true event and a great real-life story that you and I both enjoyed, and it's just wonderfully acted by Christian Bale and Matt Damon, and the casting in this movie is just incredible, and it's one that's really enjoyable from start to finish.
Absolutely. It's been a long time since we've had a good racing or car-related film, and this one was really enjoyable, and I'm glad we got the opportunity to watch it.
And it's one that we'd had on our radar, but just a lot like 1917, didn't really have a chance to go out and watch. And it's obvious to see when you watch this film why it was nominated for Best Motion Picture Award in the Oscars, and it did win a pair of Oscars for editing, both for actual film editing and for sound editing. And that's evident when you see it from scene to scene. It's just smooth transitions, everything sounds the way that it should for a racing film, which I imagine in some instances can cause some issues having that sound link up. So kudos to the editors and producers for that. And in true Nerdy by Nature fashion, spoiler alert, we are about to dive right into Ford versus Ferrari. So if you haven't had a chance to digitally download it or rent it or stream it, however you choose to do so,
right.
we don't judge here, Nerdy by Nature. You'll want to go ahead and skip over this and go all the way to the end and hear our teaser for our next episode. And with that, let's go ahead and go into our plot summarization of Ford versus Ferrari. So essentially, the head of marketing and advertisement for Ford Motor Company, Lee Iacocca, goes off to Henry Ford II, and this takes place in the 1960s, and they're not really doing so hot, Ford as a company, and so they need a spark, they need something to revitalize the market and the buyer that's soon to be a teenage group that actually can work, have their own money, and go out and buy themselves a vehicle to get from point A to B and back. Lee Iacocca lets them know, hey, Ferrari is really what we need to be working towards. They keep winning at Le Mans. They're this victory-style car. That's what resonates with the market and buyers today. They don't really care that we make a bunch of good quality cars. They want a cool race car.
Right.
And so he goes over, tries to strike a deal with Ferrari because they as a company are on the verge of bankruptcy. That really goes south. Ferrari, it's one of those situations where Ford basically, it's an old saying of if you can't beat them, join them. In this case, if you can't beat them, buy them.
Right.
And that doesn't work out. Ferrari is insulted, and of course has some not so nice things to say about Henry Ford II. Mr. Lee Iacocca comes back and lets him know exactly what he says, and basically that's what sparks Henry Ford II to say, that's fine, we'll just go ahead and make our own race car and we'll beat them at their own game, quite literally.
Yeah, it definitely seems like it became personal for him after that.
No doubt about it. And so the minds at Ford are like, okay, well, who do we need to get to jumpstart this and get it off the ground and get it going onto the track? And so they go after none other than Carroll Shelby, owner of Shelby American Motors and former successful race car driver. And Mr. Shelby has a long-time friendship with mechanical engineer and racing extraordinaire Ken Miles.
Right.
And so those two begin to work together. They have some corporate interference along the way, but ultimately make a great pair, and they end up creating a successful race car, the Ford GT40 Mark II, and that ends up finishing first, second, and third at the Le Mans race. So they take the podium in strides and beat Ferrari, and mission accomplished. And then, of course, the film, unfortunately, has a little bit of a tragic ending, but still, it's one from start to finish that's just a solid watch, and one for the whole family to enjoy. It's just a really
Definitely.
good, a feel-good buddy-buddy film. And that basically wraps up the plot for Ford versus Ferrari. So, Cap, now that we've gone over that,
Right.
let's go ahead and talk a little bit about, I think, probably arguably our favorite part of Ford versus Ferrari, and that is as we just mentioned, the buddy-buddy relationship between Matt Damon and Christian Bale's characters, respectively.
Oh yeah, they both did an excellent job in the movie, and you could really tell that they worked well together. Just in the different scenes that they were in, you could really tell that they were enjoying themselves, and I mean, it it just felt like they were friendly with each other. It didn't seem like, and I haven't read anything about, normal, oh, we hate each other, things like that. It just seemed like it was an easy, good filming experience.
And for me, I feel like that would be even more impressive if we did see articles or videos that came out after the film that said, it's a wonder that they got this one done, or that it was even on deck to be nominated for Best Picture, considering
Right.
a poor relationship off camera. But I believe in the mild research that I did, this is a pretty cut and dry film, but still very enjoyable, that we're about, to go in full depth here on. It's one that I noticed in some of the articles I read, the common theme between Bale and Damon is that they just had a clicked right away, had a very, very good off-camera relationship, and I think that what we got here in Ford versus Ferrari transpired into a very believable buddy-buddy relationship film between Ken Miles and Carroll Shelby. Now, of course, I'm not a historian, I have no idea how their actual relationship was, but I would like to think it was pretty close-knit, because in the 1960s, Ken Miles was a very big part of the Shelby/Cobra racing team and department as both a mechanical engineer, eventually their official test driver, and then also went on to be the race car driver at the famed 1966 Le Mans 24-hour race. So I like to think they got their details right. And again, Bale and Damon's chemistry throughout the entire movie is just top-notch.
Oh yeah, and one thing I did learn from this movie, I did not realize that there were any, I'm no expert, but I didn't realize that there were any races that lasted 24 hours. And just, I don't know if that's the same now as then, but that was incredibly crazy to me. That, I mean, it looked like they like kind of take turns, and like they'll come in to the pit and fix whatever needs fixing, and then the next driver will get in and do a run or whatever. But it just, that was interesting to me to find out that they had races that long.
Oh, right, exactly. And it seemed like they had about 3 to 4 drivers that they would cycle in and out, and they would drive for X amount of time and try to set the best lap times as possible for a team.
Right.
And then whoever had the best times at the same distance as everybody else, that would be who would win the Le Mans race. And for the last 5 years prior, it had been Ferrari. Everyone pretty well knew, kind of like the New York Yankees in the early 90s. You pretty well, or I should say the late 90s.
Right.
It's more so the Braves in the early 90s. Another podcast for another time.
Right.
But it's just, point being, you knew Ferrari was going to win Le Mans, among other races, year in, year out.
Yeah.
And Ford, in their struggles, as we had mentioned in the plot summarization, were basically tired of, yes, they were producing cars at a mass level, but were they really getting out to that target market, that new, fresh target market coming in the 60s, and that being those teenagers and young adults who, for the first time, were having those jobs that could afford them to buy a vehicle to get to point A and B and back, like we mentioned before. And it's just one where they realized, okay, what do they like? What are the kids into? Well, they're into fancy Italian sports cars, and there's a reason for that.
Right.
Ferrari, at the time, and John Bernthal, a.k.a. the Punisher,
Yeah.
playing Lee Iacocca, says in the meeting with Henry Ford II, look, listen, we've been thinking wrong this entire time.
Yeah.
We need to be thinking like Ferrari. They're winners. When people look at that Ferrari badge, they see victory.
Right.
And what if the Ford badge, this is a direct quote from the movie, what if the Ford badge signified victory? 17-year-olds with money in their pocket are going to want to buy a winning Ford car. That's what we need to be selling.
Yeah, I mean, Lee Iacocca, or John Bernthal, I mean, he does an excellent job of just summarizing it in that meeting when Josh Lucas, playing Leo Beebe, he says, we make more cars in a day than Ferrari makes in a year. we spend more money on toilet paper, blah, blah, blah. But Lee Iacocca, he just flat out says, Ferrari is going to go down in history as the best car maker because of their quality, not how many cars they make. And it was an easy one sentence line that just summed it up perfectly,
And it drove home his point of, look, we need to change our way of thinking. Like,
right.
Yes, we are mass-producing cars better than anybody else in the country and in some cases the world, but it doesn't really matter if the consumer is going to, like you said, buy something. They're going to choose quality over quantity.
Right.
Almost every time. And you see that look on Henry Ford II's face, played by Tracy Letts, where he's like, okay,
yeah,
Iacocca's onto something. Maybe we should actually start to focus a little bit more on quality and maybe put our hand in the racing game. And that's, of course, when Leo Beebe, the senior executive vice president of the Ford Motor Company, says, well, this would take years to develop and build. We're already behind on what you're proposing we do.
Right.
And Iacocca says, well, look, as we mentioned earlier in the plot summarization, they are going Enzo Ferrari, played by Remo Girone. He's literally sunk everything he's had into chasing this dream of perfection. And he's achieved that by winning Le Mans so often and having these quality cars that nobody else has. And by doing so, he doesn't really have much left to his name other than his craft and his product. So we need to go over there and try and strike a deal. And that's where we had said earlier, if you can't beat him, buy him.
Right.
And so he goes over there to Italy and tries to make it work. Doesn't really work out. Ends up more or less just offending Enzo Ferrari as a businessman. And actually Fiat winds up swooping in and buying Ferrari out, but still gives Enzo Ferrari control of the company and the race cars.
Yeah, and you could tell just by the look on John Bernthal's face in that scene when Enzo Ferrari is sitting there, if we do this, if y'all buy us and we want to race and y'all don't agree, are we still going to be able to race? And then, Lee Iacocca, John Bernthal, sits there and thinks for a minute, and then you really see it on his face that, well, no, if we say no, then no, you're not going to be able to race. And you could tell that he knew he lost that deal right when he said it.
That was something that's of high importance for Enzo Ferrari. It's what he's literally spent all of his money on, his life's work. He's built these cars, of course, for leisure, I'm sure, and luxury, but also to win at Le Mans and show his dominance of, look how good of a car manufacturer and engineer that I am.
Right.
So he wasn't about to give that up for, that's something your legacy, essentially.
Exactly.
It's something you can't put a price on. And so, Cap, let's go ahead and talk about the bulk of this film, and that is, of course, building the Ford GT Mark II or Ford GT40 model. Between all the work that Miles puts into it, Shelby has overseeing it, and their whole crew just spends a good amount of time trying to make the best car they can and the fastest car they can to beat Ferrari. It's no small task. There's a little diner scene before they get started where Shelby's approaching Miles and says, just let's talk it over, man.
Right.
And Miles asks, so what exactly have you done here? And Shelby says, well, got a mission here to try and beat Ferrari at racing with a Ford. And so Miles returns and says, so you mean to tell me that you want to beat Ferrari with a race car using Ford parts? How long do you have? And Shelby says, about 90 days. To which, before that, of course, Miles was like, so, did you let them know that would take hundreds of years? So, just joking about how far behind Ford is at this time frame in the racing game.
Right.
And so it's just a funny little comedic scene you get between both of them. But ultimately, Shelby has to convince Ken Miles to jump on board and be a part of this crew because Shelby sees what Miles can bring to the table, just being a mechanical engineer and really knowing cars inside and out and also being a talented racer.
Right.
And from there, they go to Ford and present themselves and say, hey, we're the guys that can get it done. If you fund us and back us, we will give you a Le Mans winning car. Let's do this. And it's neat because in certain scenes we see that Ford Motor Company and their engineers and scientists are trying very hard to use technology and new age techniques to figure out how do we make the car faster.
Right.
And it's funny because Ken Miles is more of an old school gearhead of, okay, this computer is nice, but it's literally weighing down the car. Let's get rid of this and make it lighter, and ergo, we'll make it faster. And even Shelby, they're like, well, what's he doing with the computer? Why is he taking it out? And Shelby's going, he's making the car faster. And he tells Remington, like, hey, grab some tape, grab some yarn, and we'll let the wind show us where the draft needs to be or where it's not, and what's either pulling the car down or lifting it up and giving it lift. And as they go around the test drive, the scientists that were trying to use the computer looked with binoculars and realized, oh, he's right, yeah, it's actually doing this, that, or the third. And so it's just a neat way to see, and I think pays a lot of respect to the memory of Ken Miles, of just, how much they knew about these motor vehicles and the time and effort that they put into really building something special for the Ford Motor Company.
Yeah, he definitely, it was funny. It seemed like he had a connection with cars that none of the others had. And I thought that was a really, really interesting and cool way of figuring out where the issue was and how to improve upon it by putting those little strings and everything on the car. And it was really funny when he was pulling out the computer and everything. It was such a matter of fact moment when they say, "What is he doing?" and Shelby just says, "He's making the car faster." It was just flat out. That's it. Don't worry about anything else. That's what he's doing.
And so once they have the car built, together, tested, and ready to rock and roll, they finally prepare to actually go to Le Mans over in Paris. Unfortunately, as it turns out, and you can imagine, and we've mentioned this throughout the podcast, there's a lot of corporate interference from Ford on the part of this Shelby-led team.
Mm-hmm.
And N.B.N company realizes that Miles, while he's different and a little bit of a hothead, isn't exactly the image that they want on the poster board for this brand new Mark II model from Ford at Le Mans. They want a poster boy or an All-American, somebody that's going to say what they want them to say, follow their rules, and race the way that they want them to, and not really push the limits of the car. And ultimately, still, the hopes is to have the car in one piece across the finish line.
Right.
Even though, in all rights, Miles is the engineer that's been the mastermind behind most of the car, knows the car better than probably any other driver that they have. It's just he's not exactly, good with the media per se, or they're worried that because he's different or outspoken or rebellious, he might say something that the company doesn't like or that might be off-putting to the viewer watching the race or the interviewer themselves.
And one thing I would be interested to find out is, you said BB and Company. The movie made it seem more like it was just BB, and I would be interested to know if it really was just this one guy being all hell-bent on it not being Miles, or was it really him and others in the company?
And I think that would be interesting to find out, because more often than not, with movies that are based on or loosely based on true stories or true events, of course the director is going to either create or fabricate an antagonist or some type of scene to where they need to add or sprinkle things in that may have either happened or been loosely translated.
Right.
So it does make you wonder if this, Vice President Leo Beebe really was just vehemently against Miles and wanted his guy to race and things to go his way. Because keep in mind, with the vice president position, he probably had either Henry Ford II himself or whoever he reported to telling him what they wanted done. So it could have been a combination of, I'm under pressure, and also, I'm not as much of a genuine fan of Miles, we're going to go with my guy instead. And it ultimately blows up in their face almost quite literally on the track, because Miles tells the racers as they leave for Paris, because he finds out from Shelby, hey, you're not going. And he takes it really well. You would think he would blow up and get upset, given his attitude that we'd seen earlier in the film. He had a tendency to kind of throw wrenches around and get upset.
Right.
And he takes it with stride, and he tells the driver, listen, the gearbox might run a little bit hot on that last leg. Be careful.
Mm-hmm.
And what ends up happening is the gearbox does just that, and they blow a gasket, and they end up losing to Ferrari after they've made a public announcement that we're going to beat you at the next Le Mans.
It's funny because, like you said earlier in the movie, he's portrayed as this hothead that overreacts to things, but throughout the whole movie, he never really loses his cool, other than the one time that he throws the wrench. But it's stereotypical in these movies. You think that, if he's being portrayed as a hothead, then throughout the movie you expect him to react to things a certain way. And throughout this movie, he never does. It's just like he accepts it and moves on. And so when he finds out he's not going to go, I mean, yeah, he's upset about it. You can tell he's not happy, but he never loses his cool. And he basically just says, well, be careful. This is what this can do, and this is what could go wrong. And basically, everything that he tells them goes wrong in that first race.
And like we said, that ends up leading to them losing to Ferrari. And then in that instance, Ferrari has won, if I'm not mistaken, 5 Le Mans in a row.
Yeah.
And of course, about a year's time elapses, and we wind up following back up with Shelby and Miles, still trying to work on this Mark II model and work out the kinks from that first go-around in 65. And we get a surprise visit at the test site from Henry Ford II and Leo Beebe.
Right.
And we get a hilarious moment where Shelby realizes, all right, we're going to fix Beebe's wagon and lock him in our main office, and he does just that, and Beebe realizes when it's too late what's going on, and literally busts out at one point from the office, and by that time it's too late because Shelby's already scooped up Henry Ford II into the GT40 Mark II. Because up to this point he's seen the car and the money he's paid for and funded, but he hasn't really been in the car.
Right.
And Shelby takes him on a joyride, and Henry Ford II realizes right away that this is a monster of a car, and he really understands the power and the speed behind the car, and that it's not just anybody that can sit in that driver's seat. They can't just pay anybody or a decent race car driver to drive it and expect to win. And Shelby reiterates that and says, listen, you want to win, you want to beat Ferrari, Ken Miles is your guy. That's who needs to be in this seat. I can't do it. I've got a heart condition. It's got to be Ken Miles.
Right.
And Henry Ford II, being a businessman, makes a proposal and says, tell you what, we'll let Ken race at Daytona. If he wins that, we'll let him race at Le Mans. And actually, I might be getting that reversed. It's Shelby that essentially makes the business proposal to Henry Ford II, and Henry Ford II agrees to the terms.
Right.
And so, of course, as you can imagine, Miles ends up winning in a wonderful fashion at Daytona. And it's crazy because in the movie, Leo Beebe's driver has a NASCAR pit crew, because they're at one point wondering, how are they getting out onto the track so much faster than our pit crew? And that's because they didn't have the advantage of using a well-trained, well-oiled machine that is a NASCAR pit crew. So it's really, again, Beebe trying to play against Ken Miles and stack the odds in his favor for the Ford Motor Company,
right,
to get the driver he wants to go to Le Mans. And at one point, which whether or not this actually happened, I'm not sure, but for that race as a whole, Beebe makes a big public announcement that Ford Motor Company is sponsoring the event, they're running the show, they're keeping the drivers all at about 6,000 RPM, and so towards the last couple laps of this race, they know, Miles' pit crew knows that he has to go a little bit faster to catch up and win, because they want him at Le Mans. They're tired of him missing his shot, and so on the chalkboard that they'll use oftentimes to communicate from the pit to the track, Shelby writes 7,000 or 7K, ride it like hell.
Yeah.
And when Ken sees that, he's like, oh, because he's telling him when he pits the last time, I can push this farther than 6.
Right.
I know I can push this, and I know I can handle it. And so Shelby says, turn it loose, let's go. And he does just that. The announcers get hyped up that Miles is making this big comeback. He ends up winning Daytona. And, of course, Beebe accepts it and realizes, you know what, all right. Fair enough. We'll make this work when we get to Paris. I'm still in charge.
Right.
And so is Henry Ford II. And they honor the deal. And so Miles ends up going to Paris, to Le Mans. And we just get a really great idea of how challenging and grueling this event is, because we see clips from the race previously. We know what Shelby went through to win it, and they discuss the ins and outs and the turns, and it's just one where it's a long country road track. It's not a nice, loop, circle, turn left.
Right.
Like, you are having to judge each turn, how fast to go on straight stretches, when to pass people. It's a dangerous race, and it's one that it's just like, how in the world can this work with the cycling out of drivers? Like, it's got to be grueling for them, grueling on the car. You really have to know the car inside and out, and that's why Ken Miles is the perfect guy for the job.
Right.
And in the end, of course, Miles does end up going across the finish line, which there's some controversy to that where he has to make a choice towards the end of the race. And again, not to bash BB, but it was his call, his orders.
Right.
Where he called down to Shelby and said, look, we get that Miles is setting lap records and he's doing great and we're going to win this race. But we also notice that our other two Mark II models are going to respectively finish second and third. It's going to be a historic photo. Let's slow Miles down a lap and get them to all finish together side by side in a legitimate photo finish, one for the history books
Right.
and the record books as well. And so then, of course, Shelby agrees to this, although in the movie, he seems to very much so disagree with it internally, but externally he tells Ken Miles, it's your call. I'd be very interested to know exactly how that conversation went down in real life, because I feel like it'd be very easy for the movie to play that up. As it seems like both Shelby and Miles, being men of character, would have more or less accepted those terms and did what they had to do. And so in the movie, of course, Miles does slow down and winds up being right there in line with the other two drivers. But unfortunately, because of that, what that also leads to is, I believe it's McLaren is the driver that actually, his nose hits the finish line first. And so on a technicality, while yes, Miles was the hands down best racer in that race and got Ford where they needed to be by all regards, both in design and in actually racing the car, he actually ends up finishing second while McLaren finishes first. And it's just one of those where you realize, again, the amount of character and class and sportsmanship that Miles has in this moment, because he really doesn't even so much care about the prize or the trophy so much as he knows what he's accomplished, and all three of the Mark II model cars that he helped to build and construct
Right.
and had a hand in performed so well, and it's like mission accomplished for him. Like the true mission was a success. He really wasn't about the prize at all, so he wasn't as upset. I mean, of course, from a personal standpoint internally, did he and everybody else in that stadium know who won? Absolutely.
Right. It was disappointing, and you really feel like, well, if there's ever a time for him to, go off or have a hothead moment, that would be the time. But again, it doesn't turn out that way. And like you said, that really shows the character and class of Ken Miles. And again, like you said, you realize he knows that he won and he knows what he's accomplished in this. And so while it was disappointing, it was also, just a moment where you knew who really won the race, basically.
And just to drive home that point for you, the listener, as to how much class somebody like Ken Miles had, a quote from Wikipedia from him, it's essentially describing himself.
Mm-hmm.
He says, I am a mechanic. That has been the direction of my entire vocational life. Driving is a hobby, a relaxation for me like golfing is to others. I should like to drive a Formula One machine, not for the grand prize, but just to see what it's like. I should think it would be jolly good fun.
Right.
Of course, he's just talking about Formula One racing in particular, obviously. Different style of racing car here at Le Mans, Daytona, and Sebring. And that was the other bummer for Miles, really, is he, from a sports perspective, the Triple Crown, going back to baseball real quick, is one of the highest honors you can win as a baseball player. It's where you lead the league in 3 stat categories. Much in the same way, at this particular time period in racing, they had a Triple Crown for race car driving, so that would have been
Right.
Daytona, Sebring, and Le Mans. And he would have been the first man, if I'm not mistaken, historically, I think the first one to actually do it. There's only been one other race car driver that accomplished this feat, and that was Graham Hill in 1969. And it's just one of those situations where it would have been a great feat for Miles to accomplish in racing and for himself personally, that he just ultimately never got. Now, if you wanted to say that he got cheated out of it or what have you, of course you very well can, and that's where the controversy comes into play. But ultimately he made the team play and the sacrifice and took part in a still very historic moment for Ford to finish, to rack up the podium 1 through 3.
Absolutely.
And from this moment of triumph, we sort of turn into a bit of a somber moment that, me being unfamiliar with the life and career of Ken Miles, I wasn't quite expecting. So months after this victory, they're already back at it, testing new vehicles, new frameworks and structures on these race cars, and just in a routine test drive that Miles takes. It's a new honeycomb style of material that they're using on this particular test car, and because of that, it winds up either locking up the brakes or does something that causes the car to spiral, catch fire, and crash. And earlier in the film, Miles was able to escape a similar situation that happened with the brakes, where they overheated, and he was able to be pulled out of the car in time. But in this particular instance, he was actually, from what I read about his death, was ejected from the car and essentially died instantly upon impact.
Wow.
And it's just a moment in that movie where it's that swing of where you just before were, way up high, feeling good, to the harsh reality of life at times. But the movie does come back up and end on a bright note where Shelby goes back to the home of the Mileses, both Molly and Peter, and lets them know, hey, I'm here. We're still like family. Everything's going to be all right. And Shelby bestows Peter Miles' dad, Ken Miles' wrench to him and says he would want you to have this. So it's a touching moment there in the end, and it's still overall a solid film that we really enjoyed.
Oh, yeah.
And just from start to finish was nothing but fun, and everything in between is just well worth the watch. And you can see, again, why it was nominated for a Best Picture, and it absolutely deserved the Oscar wins for both film editing and sound editing, because the whole movie is just seamless and smooth from scene to scene. And with that, pretty much wraps up the discussion for Ford versus Ferrari. Although I do, Cap, want to take a moment here and discuss some of our favorite characters and favorite scenes real quick before we get out of here. So for you, other than, obviously, Ken Miles and Carroll Shelby being everyone's main favorite characters, what characters not named Ken Miles and Carroll Shelby was one of your favorite characters or sub-characters?
As far as characters go, I would say that it would have to be John Bernthal as Lee Iacocca, just because he had some of the more memorable moments in the movie that didn't feature either Shelby or Miles. As far as scenes go, there was a really nice scene between Ken Miles and his son. I believe it takes place right before he goes to Le Mans, and they're sitting out. It's in the evening time. It's getting dark. It's a nice atmospheric scene where he's talking to his son, and he tells him, out there is the perfect lap, and basically just talks to him and says, can you see it? And his son, thinks for a minute, and he says, yeah, I think I can. And Ken Miles turns and says, well, not a lot of people can. And it was just a really touching, cool scene between a father and a son, and you could really tell that he was talking about more than just a race.
Yeah, I liked that scene as well, because he really was trying to give his son not only good advice if he were ever to consider going into that type of field, whether it's mechanical engineering or racing, but more or less a metaphor for life, I think, for that perfect lap. And so that was definitely a cool moment for sure. And then for me, one of my favorite characters, of course, Ayatollah up there, but I really liked Phil Remington, played by Ray McKinnon. And I liked Remington because to me he was kind of like that glue for the entire crew. Whether it was in the pit or on the business side, he was not only that comedic relief in certain moments of the movie, but there are also some moments where he's having to sort of be the mediator for a number of different characters, whether it's Peter Miles right after his father gets pulled out of that burning car and lets him know, hey, as long as they make it out, they're fine. And then in other moments where he has to talk down either Miles or Shelby. And so for me, his moments all felt right, and it was just a nice character that we got, a good portrayal of a real person that ultimately had just as much of an impact on this historical moment as well. So I just thought that was neat. And then scene-wise, I have to go back to him slowing down, making that decision, that moment where he had to make that tough decision of, this is a situation where the Ford Motor Company had been interfering all along. They didn't want me to be here.
Right.
And he had a choice to either go the distance and keep breaking records and just him across the finish line, or be a team player, have that sportsmanship, show a good level of character, and do something that's bigger than himself. And also, I think he had in mind his son when he did that, because in that moment, he starts to sing a song that he and his son sing after he wins his first amateur race there earlier in the film, or what I assume is an amateur race out there, with Shelby trying to promote him for, hey, he's ready for the big leads. He hops in and they start singing this particular song. I believe Miles is starting to sing that same chorus. And I think it resonates and hits and clicks in his head like, you know what? I'm going to show my son that sometimes it's not all about you. It's about being a part of something bigger than yourself. And so to me, I really liked that scene in particular. So in a weird sort of way, we both had similar favorite scenes. So let's go ahead now, Cap, in true nerdy by nature fashion, and let's rank this bad boy. So for me, and we talked about this before the podcast, I'm just, talking about spoiler alert, no spoiler alert here, I'm not that big of a racing movie guy.
Right.
So, I think I stopped after the third Fast and the Furious film. Which, according to a lot of folks, is a bad time to stop because I'm sure the franchise has gotten at least a little bit better than Tokyo Drift, so I'll say that. And that's actually not true. I did watch Fast 5, and I enjoyed that. I skipped the fourth one for whatever reason.
Yeah.
But as a whole, the franchise is solid. But for me, I'm just not as much of a car movie guy. So, with that, I docked Ford versus Ferrari a half a star from 4 to 3.5. And that's only personal preference. It's just one that I'll watch the movie again, and it's great from start to finish. Christian Bale and Matt Damon's chemistry is undeniable. I'd love to see them in other movies moving forward, and I hope that this leads to future projects. But for me, it just didn't quite have that extra for me to say that it was a game-changing film, because I'm sure there's other racing films out there that are just as good. But overall, it's one that I highly recommend you, the listener, watch, and because it's very enjoyable, again, from just the beginning to the end.
Definitely, I would agree with that, and honestly, I am more of a racing and car fan, so I would give it personally a 4 out of 5. I don't know what your hang-up is about Fast and Furious, but I am a fan. You obviously are not. That's fine. But being a car movie lover, I would say that I'm gonna give it a 4 out of 5 versus your 3.5.
I got you. That's fine. And just for the record, I like the Fast and the Furious film franchise. It's just for me, it gets to the point to where you're like, okay, how much more can we possibly do?
A lot.
With these cars, but evidently a lot, because Fast and Furious 9 is on its way this summer, so who knows, we might even go ahead, I'll have some catching up to do,
yeah.
See if we choose to review that film, but it's just, different strokes for different folks, or different things drive you, we'll say that for certain movies. I know, that's a bad pun.
Yeah, that's alright.
But that's nerdy by nature style.
I'm just messing with you all around, you know that.
Oh, of course. But again, this is a movie that we both thoroughly enjoyed, and we highly recommend it to watch. It's just a really good one all the way around.
Absolutely.
And that's going to do it for this edition of Nerdy by Nature. In our next episode, we will be reviewing the movie Bloodshot, featuring Vin Diesel and Guy Pearce. And it's based off of the graphic novel series with the same name. And it's one that we don't know a whole lot about as far as previous knowledge and background, but we definitely want to go watch and see and look into, maybe on down the road, reading the graphic novel run that's been quite popular over the last bit. And of course, obviously popular enough to merit making a movie.
Right.
And so we'll be very interested to see how this movie goes, because based on the trailer, there are some concepts that look really cool, and then other moments where we're a little concerned that it might be too cliche,
right,
and maybe a little bit cheese. But I want to speak for you, Cap. How do you feel about what we can expect from Bloodshot with Vin Diesel?
Like you, I'm not really familiar with the subject matter. I've not read the graphic novel series. I would be interested in reading it because a lot of people have enjoyed it, but judging from the trailers, let's just say I'm going to hold judgment until we see the movie, but it does present some concerns in whether or not it's just going to be a forgettable thing, or, who knows, it might be one of the best movies of the year.
And could potentially spark a Bloodshot movie franchise.
Absolutely.
So we'll see how well received it is on opening weekend. And so that's going to come to you this next time around. But until then, be sure to hit the like button, leave a comment, let us know what we got right, what we got wrong. As always, call us out. Feel free to join our Facebook group by the same name, Nerdy by Nature. It's free to join. No membership fees. come on in. And also, make sure to share this with anybody that you think would enjoy this content or this realm, that being the Nerdverse. And as always, we really appreciate you, the listener, listening and sticking with us. We are on season 2 now, so in case we forgot to mention that in this podcast episode earlier, we're rolling right along, and we'll continue to try and bring you fresh and fun content throughout the year.
Absolutely.
And so with that, as always, I'm Agent Smith signing off.
And I'm Captain Rogers. God bless.